The original Donkey Kong arcade game wasn't just the introduction of Mario, but also of jumping as a game concept. That's right, something as quaint and rudimentary as jumping wasn't a thing until Nintendo made it a thing. Prior to the game's release in 1981, the most popular arcade titles were shooters like Galaxian, or maze-based like Pac-Man. The goal of Donkey Kong was simple: get to the top of each stage while jumping to avoid hazards. The focus on jumping was expanded in the next major arcade title Nintendo put out, Mario Bros. Here, the falling damage from Donkey Kong was removed, thank God, and Mario was able to defeat Koopas by jumping underneath them. As with any major innovation, there will always be imitators, and these early Mario titles were no exception. It's important to realize that platforming was such a new concept, just the act of focusing a game around jumping hadn't been done before. And because Nintendo was the one to introduce it, Shigeru Miyamoto even thought that jumping should have been patented. That's like trying to patent the wheel. He revealed this in a 2009 Iwata Asks interview, promoting New Super Mario Bros. Wii, where he also stated, "I'm not going to let those other games top us." We had done tests where a large character jumped around with a blue sky in the background. Super Mario Bros., released in 1985 for the Nintendo Entertainment System, created the blueprint for 2D side-scrolling platform games. It takes the original concept of jumping from Donkey Kong to all new heights. Mario's jump flows perfectly with your momentum when running, and has an arc where he slows down as the leap comes to its peak. It's incredibly fluid and intuitive for a game released about 40 years ago. And when you place that perfectly programmed jump in a world with all original power-ups, enemies, and obstacles through the land, air, and sea, it's no surprise that Super Mario Bros. Set the standard that all 2D platformers would be judged by, even today. But sadly, it's a standard that even Mario himself hasn't lived up to. 2D Mario games had an impressive run through the 80s and early 90s, but ended up taking a back seat to the 3D Mario titles, starting with Super Mario 64 in 1996. That was until 2006 when we saw the release of not just a new 2D Mario game, but what ended up being an entire 2D Mario series. Of course, I'm talking about New Super Mario Bros., originally released for the Nintendo DS. It's easy to look back on the first New Super Mario Bros. Title with the knowledge that we have now about where the series would go, but the original game was actually very well received at the time. Did it get an artificial boost in its reviews thanks to being the first 2D Mario game in such a long time? Probably, but it's still a solid title, and serves as a good introduction of the classic Mario formula into the 21st century. It felt like a jumping off point for Mario platformers, the start of a new era that could usher in the type of innovation that the original arcade and NES games did. But as we all know, that's not what happened, was it? Why bother trying to come up with new ideas that push the genre forward when you can just make the same game 3 more times? Especially when they're going to sell millions upon millions of copies no matter what. So after the first New Super Mario Bros. Title, they released New Super Mario Bros. Wii, 2, and U. The differences between each entry are pretty minor. Wii introduced simultaneous multiplayer and brought back Yoshi. 2's gimmick was flooding the player with coins, and U, well, let's talk about U in a little more detail. I want to focus in on New Super Mario Bros. U for a few reasons. First, it's of course the most recently released title, which puts it in the position where it does serve as the culmination of the entire series. Also, either shockingly or entirely unsurprisingly, it introduces less new mechanics than any of the other entries. It has very few original ideas, a few new power-ups, some small style changes, but that's all it has to offer. And to demonstrate just how far 2D Mario has fallen over the years, I want to compare it to what many regard as the pinnacle of the entire series, Super Mario Bros. 3. You might say it's unfair to compare New Super Mario Bros. U to one of the greatest games of all time, but I disagree heavily. It's from the same series, developed by the same company, with many of the same people like Takashi Tezuka having their hands in both titles. But to go back and forth between playing Super Mario Bros. 3 and New Super Mario Bros. U, it's completely night and day. There's one main problem with U that infects all aspects of the game like a virus and brings the entire experience down. That's the lack of any real challenge. Super Mario Bros. 3 is not an extremely hard game, especially by the standards of the NES era, but it's definitely no walk in the park. Each individual level feels like it's testing a different skill. When doing a full playthrough, you'll likely see the game over screen a good few times, a sight that might not be the most welcome, but puts the pressure on you to keep going. Every death feels fair, like it's your fault, and gives you information on how to avoid that obstacle on your next life. The levels are very short, which is probably due more to the limitations of the hardware than anything else, but their concise nature keeps them challenging while not being frustrating. Even if you die towards the end of a level, it doesn't take long to get right back where you were. If there's only one thing that other titles should take from Super Mario Bros. 3, it's the game's balance. It provides a hefty challenge, but one that's very overcomable with the right amount of practice. New Super Mario Bros. U, on the other hand, is basically the video game equivalent of a plastic playpen for babies. It feels like the developers were wearing rubber gloves while designing it. It's like they were afraid of giving the player any real challenges, even though facing and succeeding at those challenges is what makes for satisfying gameplay. The clearest example of this design mindset would be the power-ups, or more specifically, the amount of power-ups the game throws at you. Compared to Mario 3, you're flooded with items at every moment. Anytime you get hit and go back to either regular Mario or small Mario, which is already pretty rare thanks to how easy the levels are, the game seems to almost say, "Oh no, don't cry, we've got another power-up for you right here." It doesn't help that the power-ups that could be considered the stars of each game completely trivialize any challenge that the game provides. On the box of the first game, Mario has used a Mega Mushroom, which basically lets you stomp through the level on autopilot, requiring minimal input from the player aside from holding right. The box art of New Super Mario Bros. Wii features the Propeller Mushroom power-up, which is essentially a super high double jump, and New Super Mario Bros. U shows off the Super Acorn, both in its power-up form and being used by Yellow Toad. It functions almost the same as the Propeller Mushroom, and both power-ups totally negate any obstacles posed by requiring careful platforming, which is the entire point of the game. How often the game gives you power-ups without you needing to earn them is a level of generosity that borders on obnoxiousness. It's like the game is so afraid of hurting your feelings that it'll take every measure possible to ensure you're at full strength at all times. It even lets you hold on to power-ups that you get from Toad Houses and other bonuses to use whenever you'd like before starting a level. But the whole thing feels pointless because you're given a power-up in the first 10 seconds of starting each level anyway, even if you're coming into a checkpoint. Some of the most exciting moments in a 2D Mario game are when you're small Mario, trying your best to navigate through a difficult level. You know that because you're small, you can't take a single hit, which cranks up the pressure and sucks your full attention into the game. The controller starts getting slippery in your sweaty hands, your eyes dry out from not being able to blink, and you find yourself leaning towards the TV like it's the last 10 seconds of the Super Bowl. And when you finally touch that flagpole, it's like a wave of relief rushes over your entire body. Pressure creates diamonds, and at its best, 2D Mario can give you the whole jewelry store. This is a feeling that Super Mario Bros. 3 is able to create with impressive consistency. When you get hit and lose a power-up, you'll likely have to make it through the rest of the level in this vulnerable state. Your actions have consequences in a way they simply don't in New Super Mario Bros. U. When you make a stupid mistake and lose your raccoon suit, you feel it. Mario 3 doesn't coddle you and say, "Oh, don't worry, we'll give you another power-up so you feel better." No, the game lets you sit with your failures. Yeah, it might not feel great right then, but those moments of despair are what makes the moments of success so much more gratifying. When you do well at a stage, it's because you're doing the work to get there, not because the game is spoon-feeding you success. The issue with power-ups is the same story with lives. I've said before how lives are an outdated mechanic, but both games feature them, so I think it's worth comparing how they both handle them. And besides, both games also have scoring systems, which are way more outdated than lives anyway. On paper, lives work pretty much the same way. You start off with a set number, and you're able to gain extra lives by finding them in the levels, from bonus areas on the map, or by collecting 100 coins. In Super Mario Bros. 3, you really have to work for extra lives. They don't just pop up easily. They're more few and far between, and when you play the Toad House minigames, it's often that you'll walk away empty-handed. And to get a life from gathering 100 coins, you've got to make a concerted effort in order to do it. Compare that to New Super Mario Bros. U, which takes every opportunity it gets to shove 1-up mushrooms down your throat. They're everywhere throughout the levels. Toad Houses basically hand them over with hardly any input from the player, and you'll get extras from collecting 100 coins without even realizing it. To take a slightly more empirical look on how both games handle lives, when I beat the first world of Mario 3, I had 9 extra lives. When I beat the first world of Mario U, I had 23. The problem with making power-ups, extra lives, and coins as prolific as New Super Mario Bros. U does is that it massively drops the value of each item. There's no point in going out of your way to collect coins when you already have tons of extra lives. There's no point in hunting for power-ups when the level design is so easy. There's no point in trying to hold on to your power-up when you know there will be another one right around the corner. Maybe this low level of difficulty could be forgiven if the game was constantly surprising you with clever and interesting level design, but it doesn't. Each new Super Mario Bros. Game uses the tried and true formula of introducing a new mechanic each level, changing it up in a few ways, and then moving on to something new for the next stage. It's a formula that can work wonderfully, but only if it's executed well. And in the case of New Super Mario Bros. U, it is most certainly not. Most of the mechanics featured in each level are things that you've seen before if you've played basically any other Mario game. I've dealt with spinning grass and dark areas and falling icicles before. Give me something new. And if you're going to use the same mechanics, at least provide me more of a challenge than you did before. But no, Mario Bros. U can't even do that. When you contrast this with Super Mario Bros. 3, you're trying to get every 1-up, power-up, and coin that you can in that game, because each one you collect brings the challenge down just a bit. But when there is no challenge, what's the point of any of it? It's especially frustrating that New Super Mario Bros. U suffers from these problems because 2D Mario games being too easy is something that Nintendo was well aware of prior to starting development. In that same Iwata Asks interview where Miyamoto said he wanted to patent jumping, he also talked about the original DS title being too easy. Iwata said, "Well, you succeeded in coming up with a Mario title that anyone could play. For those players who were seeking a bit more of a challenge, it may have been a touch too easy." To which Miyamoto replied, "As you can imagine, no matter how hard you try, it just isn't possible to settle on a difficulty level that will satisfy everyone, ranging from people who haven't played a game in years, right through to players who know all the Mario games inside and out. You have to focus it on either one or the other." And this quote, coming from such a legendary game designer, is just so disheartening to read. Like, has Miyamoto never heard of games having multiple difficulties before? Dumbing things down for the lowest common denominator will do nothing but anger longtime fans. And there's a lot of longtime Mario fans out there, probably more than any other franchise in gaming, given its popularity. But even when Nintendo does take the time to cater to a group of fans with a different skill level than what the core game focuses on, it's never the more experienced players. It's always the ones who seem to have never picked up a controller before. Like the Super Guide, introduced in New Super Mario Bros. Wii, which lets the computer literally play the game for you if it gets too hard. Or the Gold Tanuki suit, which appears after you've died on the same level a few times and gives you total invincibility. I'm not against giving less experienced players options to help them get through a level, but to do it for an already overly easy game and not including anything to make the game more challenging for more experienced players makes zero sense. Contrary to what Miyamoto is saying, these newer Mario games do work to target two separate difficulty levels, easy and super easy. Yeah, you could make the game more exciting by doing some sort of a challenge run, like going through and intentionally not picking up any items. But a game shouldn't rely on a player placing self-imposed limits in order to make it a more enjoyable experience. It needs to have it built in. The original Super Mario Bros. Had what could be considered a New Game Plus, where all Goombas were replaced with Buzzy Beetles after you beat the game. Why not something like that? But unlocked from the start, ideally. It's a sad thing, seeing the franchise that defined 2D platforming fall so far. The easiness of New Super Mario Bros. U is pervasive and drags all aspects of the experience down. The focus on holding the hands of new players while kicking those seeking a challenge to the curb is supremely disappointing, but maybe that's just the state of Nintendo 2D platformers. Maybe the company just sees them as an entry point genre, something to introduce new players to before easing them into a more complicated type of game. But just because things might be bleak in the moment doesn't mean they'll stay that way forever. Nintendo's most handholdy title might be The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword, but that game was followed up by Breath of the Wild, which at the time was the most open-ended any game in the franchise had ever been. 3D Mario looked to be going down a more linear path with titles like 3D Land and 3D World, before being entirely blown wide open with Odyssey. So who knows? Maybe the next leap forward for 2D Mario is peeking over the horizon. There's no shortage of great 2D platformers still releasing, especially from indie developers. Games like Celeste, Shovel Knight, and Super Meat Boy are some of the best titles the genre has to offer. But Mario is the series that defined what 2D platformers, and really what video games as a whole, could be. Everyone wants to be the king, and Mario even says, "Mario #1! And so while Mario is still on top thanks to his longevity, nothing is guaranteed forever. As it seems Nintendo has finally unshackled the chains of the new Super Mario Bros. Series, it's exciting to see where 2D Mario goes from here, and hopefully he can fill players with wonder and joy, just like back in the NES days.